Hello and welcome to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, Minnesota's best weekly breakdown of political news inside and outside the Capitol. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, political activist and former state representative from southern Minnesota. And as usual, we're joined by Walter Hudson, state representative from District 30A, based in Albertville. Walter, Super Tuesday has come and gone. Trump is now our candidate. He's very close to cinching the actual delegates needed to win the nomination. But Nikki Haley won one state. She won New Hampshire. I think it was New Hampshire or Vermont, one of the two.
Connecticut or something.
Yeah. And it was basically because of an enormous groundswell of support from Democrats. Even the liberal stations, I was watching MSNBC and stuff just to watch their craziness reaction. And they were saying, well, when our exit polling, most of the people that we interviewed, voting for Nikki Haley said that they were either independents or Democrats. So Democrats turned out in force to vote for Nikki Haley. Even in Minnesota, this is the first time in my lifetime I remember that Republican turnout in a primary beat Democrats, and it was because Nikki Haley got a third of the vote on the Republican ballot because so many Democrats flipped over to vote in our open primary for Nikki Haley.
Yeah, no doubt.
So we have Trump running against Biden. So a rematch from last time. Obviously, in all the polling, even on the liberal station, said the number one issue driving people to vote yesterday was immigration, which Trump is leading on and led on and had led on when he was in office.
Yeah, I mean, things are looking really good. I got to tell you, what a difference a weekend makes in terms of, we were coming out, and we'll talk about this later, but we came out of last week here at the legislature, just feeling railroaded and down in the dumps regarding the revelations of what Democrats are doing in this state. But then, over the weekend, we've had some victories this week that are very prominent and noteworthy. And that's in spite of the fact that we're in the absolute minority with complete trifecta control by Democrats. And then nationally, you've got this development with what's going on with Donald Trump, where, as you say, polling, even from lefty sources, is indicating that this is his to lose. I mean, you don't want to be too Pollyannish, but, independents are breaking his way. Demographically, you're seeing things similar to what happened in 2016, where increases in Hispanic interest, increase in African-American interest. And there's just the enthusiasm too, right? So people who are voting for Trump are voting for Trump, whereas people who are voting for Biden are voting against Trump. So it all surrounds him. It's all about how you feel about Donald Trump, which gives him the advantage. There's a lack of enthusiasm amongst Democrats for a couple of different reasons. Just the general lack of competence of Joe Biden, and frankly, his lack of fitness to be president. He's not actually president right now. The country's being run in his name by people who can actually think and get up at a decent hour. And so, people know that. Like, people aren't dumb. They understand that it's a choice between a empty vessel and somebody who we can all remember what life was like when he was in charge, and it was a heck of a lot better than it is now. You weren't on the verge of World War III. You didn't have all this massive inflation, setting aside the fact that a lot of that is a direct result of the way that we handled the pandemic, which definitely cut into the last year of his first term. But just on its surface level, the sentiment is it's about nostalgia. It's about things were better before. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Most definitely not. Was the world better off 4 years ago? Yeah, I think it was. And that's what's the wind that is at the back of Donald Trump right now. And then the other thing I'll say is that the leftist coalition is falling apart, in particular over this Hamas stuff. So you've got this whole, vote uncommitted movement that has gained traction in several states, Michigan, and right here in Minnesota, we saw upwards of, depending on the area, upwards of 25% of Democratic voters vote uncommitted. That is a statement in opposition to the existence of Israel. So they have a genocide problem in the Democrat Party, and they feel so strongly about it that they're willing to throw their own incumbent president under the bus over it. Which, hey, what it's just like back in the day. What Joseph said, what you meant for evil, I mean for good. That may in fact end up being the case in the 2024 general election.
Right. And, I feel bad for Dean Phillips because Uncommitted beat him in his home state. And, I don't know why the Uncommitted crowd didn't go and vote for Dean Phillips instead of Biden, because I think Phillips has made statements about, calling for a ceasefire and things like that in the Middle East. But it was overwhelmingly a great night for Donald Trump last night. Meanwhile, in the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C., they averted a shutdown last week by passing a bridge bill or an omnibus bill that just funds government for another week until they could figure this out. And Chuck Schumer, the Democrat leader in the Senate, passed this enormous pork-filled a multi-subject omnibus bill in the Senate worth trillions of dollars, $1.65 trillion. In fact, they've changed the rules so that you can't even amend the bill and add anything. There's like 500 pages of earmarks. I mean, it's absolutely riddled with pork. There was even a multi-million-dollar earmark for Senator Fetterman in Pennsylvania to fund an LGBTQ sex club. It was just like, and when that got out, they're like, well, we can't take it out because, the rules. And finally, the Senate voted like unanimously to remove that one earmark. But that bill was coming to the House to vote on, and Republicans in the House have, thousands of earmarks in this bill, spending billions of dollars on crap that we shouldn't be spending of money on because we're $34.4 trillion in debt. And this bill is larger than Nancy Pelosi's budget when she was the speaker, when it was under Democrat control, and it grows government above that. And it continues almost all of the policies that Nancy Pelosi put in place. It's just basically continuing to fund government under with Democrats when they controlled Congress. And right now, the Republicans have the majority in the House. It's so infuriating for people who are excited to see conservatives take over the House to actually put a stop to this ridiculous spending. And they're just kicking the can down the road like they always do.
Yeah. I don't even know what to say about it at this point. All I can tell you is, from my own experience here in Minnesota, it's very clear that people are done with talk and no walk. People are done with you complaining about what the Democrats do and then not doing a whole lot that's very much different. And they're so over it that they're not showing up. I mean, we didn't see, it's kind of interesting looking at these numbers from the presidential primary, because on the one hand, it's definitely noteworthy and impressive. On the other hand, you look at the total numbers of people who came out, I'm pretty sure it was like under 400,000 statewide.
Yeah.
This is a state of 6 million people.
Yeah, but Walter, I mean, there's no reason to vote yesterday because Trump had this locked up and Joe Biden had it locked up. Like and there's nothing else on the ballot, right? The other states had congressional primaries and things to get out and vote for. There's no reason to vote. And I got after Carnahan 4 years ago when we started the presidential primary that it was just this $14 million taxpayer-funded data collection effort for the parties so that they can identify who the Republicans are and who the Democrats are to improve our door-knocking data for elected officials to benefit from. It doesn't. I mean, they're getting rid of the caucus system. They're empowering the parties to get better data, but Carnahan removed everybody except for Trump on the ballot 4 years ago so that he was unopposed. Well, if you want to do something to prevent Republicans from going to remove their incentive, then give them only one thing on the ballot to vote for and only one candidate in that race. So there was hardly, I knew a lot of really good conservatives that went out and voted for Bernie Sanders 4 years ago because it was the only thing they could do to put their thumb in the eye for Biden. Voting for Trump wasn't going to change the outcome of the race at all. And so it actually, made our data worse because now we have all these Republicans that show up as Democrats in the data center. But same thing with yesterday. And there wasn't, DeSantis dropped out. Haley's not even a threat. So why vote? And so the turnout was down. Democrats probably had a bigger desire to go out and vote uncommitted for Biden. But again, we beat Democrats in the turnout. You talk about getting people engaged and getting them off the couch. I'm critical of this movement against the state flag or changing or trying to keep the old flag, because I honestly don't care that much about the flag. I'm not in love with the old one, but it's not, of all the issues that we should be fighting for in St. Paul, that's way down on the list. And there was a pretty dismal turnout for the rally they had on the Capitol steps yesterday. There was maybe 24 people, and a bunch of them were media. And it's not going to get people off the couch. But the issue that I do see of getting people off the couch, and we talked about the suicide bill, but there is this issue that came through committee last week that really is an attack on free speech and freedom of religion. Can you set that one up for a discussion here so that people understand what it is and what the impacts of this bill are and why they should care?
Well, I'll preface it by touching back on the state flag issue just real quickly. And I agree with you. It's sad that that's the issue that seems to be the emphasis of so many of our folks who are in charge of messaging. Because I agree with you clearly by virtue of the fact that, because I was in that crowd yesterday, um, you're right. A big chunk of it was media. Another big chunk of it was legislators. So, like, in terms of people who got off their couch and drove down to St. Paul because they cared about it, there were some there and they were very passionate, but they were very few. And that, I think, that is indicative of interest in that particular issue. However, I will say that the issue is still very important as an illustrative talking point for how the Democrats are conducting their business and how what hypocrites they are when it comes to the concept of democracy and representation, because their rhetoric is all about how important it is for people to have a say and for democracy to prevail, and yet at every turn they deny Minnesotans the opportunity to have a voice in how they're governed. If they can figure out a way to get a small group of hand-picked radical fringe leftist activists to decide something for all 6 million people in the state, they absolutely will at every opportunity. That was certainly the case with the state flag. It is also the case that they wanted to go that direction with school resource officers, which we could talk about later potentially. And it's certainly the way that they went with this Human Rights Act. So the Human Rights Act, this is kind of difficult to unpack in a concise manner because there's a lot of background to it.
Well, let's talk about what the Human Rights Act was that was passed, last session or the session before that?
Right. So the original Human Rights Act, I believe, was enacted in 1993, and it created protected classes and said you can't discriminate against these protected classes. It had, and amongst those classes in 93 was sexual orientation. But it had a religious exemption in there that exempted religious institutions, religious schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, faith-based organizations, so like Minnesota Teen Challenge, groups like that, exempted them from claims of discrimination based upon sexual orientation. Obviously,
and just so we can put that in context, so that if a mosque wants to have an imam preach to their mosque, that they don't have to hire someone who's openly gay and in goes against the principles of Islam, right? So that you're not forcing a church to have to hire someone that doesn't align with their religious principles.
So back in 93, nobody knew what a gender identity was, because as a society we were significantly more sane back in 1993. As that idea has emerged in the culture of the subsequent decades, it was subsumed within the concept of sexual orientation. So the religious exemption prevailed over the years because gender identity was considered part and parcel of sexual orientation. Well, last year, they amended the Human Rights Act and they took the trouble to create a separate and distinct category for gender identity. What they didn't do is place that new category within the religious exemption. So by changing the law in that manner, what they effectively did was they opened up all these religious institutions, schools, churches, mosques, synagogues, what have you, up to claims of discrimination based upon gender identity. So feasibly, you could have a situation right now today under currently enacted Minnesota law where you had a mosque where somebody applied for a job and it was dude who looks like a lady, right? And they say no, and they could be open to a discrimination claim based upon that, saying, this is my gender identity. I've been discriminated against on account of it. You're in violation of the Human Rights Act. Here we go, right? And so this is something that came to the attention of a coalition of faith-based groups and faith-based advocacy groups apparently months ago during the interim. And when they discovered this, they approached members like Harry Niska and Peggy Scott, who are on the Judiciary Committee, and they kind of started asking questions about it and probing about it. And the strategic choice that they made at that time was to assume the best, to assume that it was an oversight, that they weren't thinking when they created this new category and didn't include it in the religious exemption. And this is something that we ought to be able to fix, and it shouldn't be a problem. We should be able to get it taken care of in short order. So they started to engage with the Department of Human Rights and got stonewalled and got the runaround, and were not being engaged with in good faith, apparently. And their goal through that process was to try to get the department in their agency bill, their policy bill that they put forward this year, which is usually a pretty sleepy, non-controversial affair that just has like technical corrections to statute because somebody had a drafting error or something along those lines, to include within that the reinsertion of gender identity into the religious exemption. That bill dropped last week, and it didn't have this correction in it. So at that point, it became clear that there was no intention to fix this. And so in order to pull the alarm bell and actually flesh this out and cast light onto it, Harry Niska brought an amendment to the Judiciary Committee when this bill was heard, to reinsert gender identity back into the religious exemption. And what followed was about 15 minutes of Democrats absolutely berating the entire religious community of the state of Minnesota. And I do mean the whole spectrum of the faith community. You had Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, all represented by various faith organizations. I think there were 5 different testifiers. And, these were not like stark raving, Bible thumping madmen that were up there preaching fire and brimstone. These were sensible, reasonable, soft-spoken members who represent entire denominations and coalitions of denominations, the faith community, very pleasantly and reasonably asking to have their First Amendment right to freedom of association and religious expression reinstated after the Democrats nullified it last year to no pomp and circumstance. And so you had Luke Fredericks, you had Byron Curran, you had Lee Finke, all in turn telling our religious community that they're wrong, that they're hateful. Luke Frederickson, I can't remember if it's Fredericks or Frederickson.
Frederick.
Luke Frederick compared the desire to have your religious liberty and your freedom of expression, compared it to chattel slavery. There was no, as Harry Niska said, the mask was taken off, and they displayed their full, deeply felt contempt for religious people in the state of Minnesota. And so that's where things were left last week, was with us sounding the alarm bell on that issue.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, if that doesn't get you off the couch to care about religious freedom, which is one of the most important principles of this country, is free speech, free expression, freedom of association, freedom of religion, where government can get involved in dictating what religions can and can't do. I mean, it's shocking to me that hasn't, that they put up such a fight. And it's also probably telling that this was pre-authorized by the party. Like they had a caucus, they discussed whether this is going to be something they fight against or not, and they chose to fight against it. I can't help but think that that the Democrats and their stance on many of these issues. And Democrats fall in line. Republicans don't. We fight amongst each other on principle and whatever, but Democrats usually fall in line when it comes time for election. And we are in the thick of an election year. The Biden administration and Democrats all the way down the line with sanctuary cities, sanctuary states, open borders, they've been pushing this policy, and all of a sudden it's coming back to bite them. And even Democrats are pushing back and saying, wait a minute, we need to fix the border, right? You got Joe Biden, through executive action, implementing many of the things that President Trump did when he was president, and actually saying this is, some of these policies are what the former president had in place too, and as a means to tell Democrats that, hey, this is how we fix it. So they're pulling back on this, so that because they don't want to lose elections, and so for Democrats to authorize an attack on religion like this, it's dumbfounding. Either they know something that we don't because they're going to fix the election come November, or I don't understand how they're continuing to go out on a limb, in a rather thin and shaky limb like this, where this could be their overturning Roe, to put it in perspective.
Yeah.
And bringing more people into the fight that they didn't know existed.
Yeah, my take on it is I think it's both more insidious and less intentional than your evaluation suggests. And what I mean by that is that I don't think that like the leadership of the legislative caucuses, maybe Aaron Murphy, but I don't think the leadership of the legislative caucuses or the Democrat Party in this state wants to touch this with a 10-foot pole. But they don't have any choice. They are being led around by the nose from a contingent of fringe radicals who want to do everything from tie a George Floyd memorial millstone around the neck of every cop to tell bishops to go to hell, right? Like the people that they have in their caucus, this queer caucus, the BIPOC caucus, the woke caucus, like all these different sub caucuses that they have. It's kind of interesting because it's like you make that point, and I agree with you generally speaking that Democrats come together and they unite, and we're constantly independent and fighting each other. That's certainly true to an extent. It's also not entirely true because they have these factions. They're better at keeping their fights behind closed doors. That's really what it comes down to. And they're also better at rallying when it comes time to vote, to all kind of voting together in a single block, with some notable exceptions that we might talk about here later. But I think what's happening is, you've got Byron Curran, you've got Lee Finke, you've got Kowalski, basically this queer caucus, right? And for them, it's personal. Like, I do not doubt the sincerity of any of my colleagues from the LGBT community. I believe that they believe what they are saying. And so for them, I mean, Byron Curran and Finke both talked last Thursday in terms as if their very existence were on the line. That if we were to allow this religious exemption, if we were to uphold the First Amendment rights of religious organizations, that would be on par with, the word that Finke used was eradication. We would be eradicating the trans community if we allowed churches, mosques, and synagogues to have their First Amendment religious liberty and freedom of association. And while that's obviously absurd, there's nothing even remotely respectable about that position. I believe that they actually think that way. And so for them, this is literally do or die as far as they're concerned. And while many people, perhaps even most people within their caucus, don't necessarily agree with that level of intensity around the issue, they certainly don't dare in this environment want to be. I mean, imagine how I had a gal come into my office last Thursday, this same day. Thursday was a busy day around here last week. Unscheduled meeting, popped in. She's an elderly lady. She's going back to school. She wants to become a social worker. And she told me her story. The entire time she was in here, she was terrified. She was terrified that someone was going to notice that she walked in the door. She was terrified that somebody's going to be hearing what she had to say. We're in my office with the door closed, and she's looking over her shoulder, or she's telling me what she believes and thanking me for the things that I say and what have you. If that's how people on our side, if that's how scared our people are, imagine how scared their side is about stepping out of line and being called out for being transphobic or racist or whatever the case may be. And so there's an outsized amount of power that these fringe kooks have over the overall party process. And what the problem that, and the reason why I know, or at least substantially suspect, that Democratic leadership knows that this is not a political winner for them is we're just having the conversation now, right? Like, if you thought it was a political winner to disenfranchise the entire spectrum of the faith community in the state of Minnesota in order to please Lee Finke, if you thought that that was a good political move, we would have heard about it loud and clear, loud and proud last year. They would have been talking about it. They would have been on Almanac taking credit for it. They would have been out parading through the streets all summer, talking about how wonderful they are and how wonderful what they did was. They would have highlighted it during the month of June, Pride Month, right? They never talked about doing this until we forced them to talk about doing it. And since we brought it up last week, what have you heard from Democrats? Crickets. Nothing. Nada. Even from the crazies, even the kooks aren't rising up to defend their own comments made in committee because they know they are on the losing side of this issue. And so what that tells me is that there's just no way that, like, they're hoping it goes away. But in order for it to go away, they're going to have to make concessions, and we're going to be shining the spotlight the entire time, making it very clear that they have to make those concessions. And there's just no way for this to work out for them unless they decide to buckle down and just commit to their anti-First Amendment position and then suffer those consequences. Either way, it's not going to work out well for them.
I just can't believe the Democrats are serious about trying to protect this issue. Like, it's what I've seen in St. Paul is that the Democrats, they let some fringe idea bubble up. They watch the Republicans get all wound up about it, and then they use that as a negotiating tool to get something else that they want, more bonding, whatever. It's kind of like last session when, in fact, this is a Lee Finke thing too, where it was the definition of what was it? A pedophile was put into the protected class statute. Remember that? And it was like, wait a minute. I mean, it was like, you guys want to offer pedophilia as a protected class, which means that, they can be out and can't be discriminated against in the workplace and whatever. Like, are you serious? And it was, that was like too much for them to handle. So they had to back off a little bit. But this might be one of those things where they just let it bubble up so they can use it as a negotiating tactic and get Republicans to vote for the bonding bill.
Well, just to remind everyone, yeah, they backed off at first, including Finke. They voted unanimously on the House floor to fix that issue because, just to reframe that, what happened there was, and I believe that was also the Human Rights Act, is they took out language that made it clear.
It exempted pedophilia from being in that protected class.
Yeah, because what it said was, because the definitions matter, right? Especially in the law. And the definition of sexual orientation is something very close to a sexual attachment between a person and a person of the same biological sex or something along those lines. Well, the word person is not age exclusive, right? And so if you want to exempt minors, children, then you have to specifically say this does not apply to a sexual attachment by an adult to a child. That was the language that was in the law, making it clear that sexual orientation as a protected class does not include pedophiles. They struck that language out, which had the effect of making pedophiles a protected class. Like, just by the letter of the law, that's what it does.
Yep.
And so we pointed that out, and this was another Harry Niska thing. Niska's great. We pointed that out. He brought an amendment. We had the argument on the floor. They were forced to take it. They were forced to fix it. It actually wasn't on the first try either. They had a long story that's not worth telling. But then they turned around in conference committee in negotiations with the Senate, and they came back with that language taken out again. And then all the Democrats voted to pass off the Human Rights Act, like enacting, again, under current law, enacted by the Democrats in this state and signed by Governor Walz. Pedophilia is, in effect, a protected class under the law in the Human Rights Act today. And after voting unanimously with us to prevent that from happening, they turned around and all voted against us to go the other direction. And again, it speaks to the power that these fringe radicals have, especially in the Senate, where they only have a one-member majority. That's how this happened. Anecdotally, the scuttlebutt was that Erin May Quaid threw a fit about us protecting kids. And so they changed their position in order to accommodate her, because she could burn this whole place down if she wanted to, with her one-member majority status. That is the character of the evil that we're dealing with down here. But in spite of that, there are limitations, and we can and have been claiming victories against them, even from the minority, even under a trifecta. And this is one of those issues today. This bill, the Human Rights Policy Bill in question, was going to be heard in another committee. It has been pulled indefinitely. And the religious organizations have been coming out in force. People have been getting active. I have never seen the passion over an issue, any issue, not even abortion, like I've seen over this issue. People are ready to fight. The Catholic Conference, Minnesota Family Council, if you're not on their mailing lists, you should be getting on their mailing lists, because they're going to be keeping you up to the minute on what's going on with this and providing action alerts for how you can help, how you can engage in an effective manner. And it's already proving effective in stopping them.
Yeah. During the COVID lockdowns, I'll put this in some perspective, when Walz started shutting down churches, that also activated the religious community like I've never seen before. And we had lots of phone calls. This is all behind the scenes, lawsuits put together, private meetings with the Walz administration to pressure him to back off of forcing religious schools from the mask mandates, right? So those were all exemptions saying you guys don't have to do mask mandates in the schools, right? It also was a huge boon for religious schools because their enrollment numbers shot up, right? People were pulling their kids from public schools and enrolling them in Catholic schools and Lutheran schools and what have you. So it was interesting, but I've never seen the religious community get that engaged on that issue or on any issue politically. So it's good that people get touched by government in a bad way once in a while because it gets them off the couch. But like we said on the onset, I don't think that the flag issue, even though I think Republicans are getting confused when you poll people and they answer whether they're on your side or not. They use that number like, well, 80% of people oppose changing the flag. Sure, but it isn't the level of severity that religious things like you have to look at how important this issue is. Like, does it actually pull on something deep inside of them that's going to engage them, or is it kind of like, and nobody likes change in general? And so, whether they even know what our flag is. And there was a guy at the thing yesterday, I saw he had his flag upside down. I see that the Minnesota state flag, because it's so just indistinguishable. I see a lot of times in front of schools and stuff now, the flag's upside down because they don't even look at the dang flag when they raise it. It's just that kind of meaningless.
Yeah, I mean, the point you're making is an essential point, that just because somebody's on your side of the issue doesn't mean that issue matters to them at a level that's going to motivate them to get out and do anything for you. I do think, like, and again, I think there's really solid points to be made around the flag issue, but I think you make those points. It should be like frosting on the cake, right? Where like you're making those points in relation to things that people care about more, and then you just toss on. And by the way, this is also why they're changing the flag, because they want to declare victory over a conquered land, and that clearly the reason why they're doing it is to displace you. Like the flag is a political symbol, obviously. And their argument is, well, we need a flag that represents everyone. And yet they're literally not letting anyone have a say except for 13 people. Because by everyone and by inclusion, they very clearly mean the opposite, right? They want to displace the status quo. As Luke Frederick said the other day, they want to destroy or disrupt the status quo, break it. That was the word. They want to break the status quo. And symbolically, for them, this is a big deal. And that's why you see like the folks on the left already buying their new state flag and changing, putting it on their social media, because for them, it really is a banner of victory over the status quo, which is to say, you and your values and everything that you believe in and hold dear. They believe as though they've conquered you, and they want you to look up in the sky and see evidence of it every time you walk by a school or a government building. Now, that's the way I feel about it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to lead with that when I'm talking to people, but when I'm given a list of here's things Democrats are doing, I definitely will include that in the list.
Yeah, and I just think the Democrats are using the new state flag as their symbol and stuff because they have a lack of things to be proud about. It used to be for the last 3 years it was get a COVID booster. Well, now they're on their 10th booster, and they don't want to put that face frame on Facebook about get your 10th booster shot, or the vaccinated symbol, or they're wearing their for a long time they were showing pictures of themselves wearing masks because the masks, as I've said, are like the MAGA hat of the left.
Yes.
It was like,
Yeah.
and there's nothing to be proud about for the Biden administration or what he's accomplished. So they have a lack of symbology that they can be proud of. And the rainbow flag has just gotten to be just old, and it doesn't mean anything anymore. It's too mainstream for them.
Did you hear about the rainbow flag bill that's making its way through?
Yeah, so let's talk about that briefly. My understanding is that that there was a Hispanic teacher who was forced to take her LGBTQ plus flag down from her classroom, and now in response, the bill is it saying that schools can't take those flags down, or is it saying that it has to be displayed?
It is nuts. It is absolutely nuts. The bill specifically applies only to rainbow symbology and says that in particular cannot be banned in any government building. So what they're doing is they're singling out expression, an expression of identity, an expression of opinion, a political expression. They're singling that out and saying that alone cannot be banned in a government building, but literally anything else can.
Yeah, and I'm conflicted on this. This is one of those issues where I go back to like, what is the position of liberty? And the position of liberty is that a government institution, whether it's the Capitol, the Department of Revenue, or schools, cannot infringe on one's First Amendment right for free expression. And I don't think that schools should be able to ban any flag. You know what I mean? Like that's what it comes down to. I think from the side of the First Amendment, it's government can't infringe on one's right to free expression. Private schools could ban anything they want, but I don't think public schools have a right to ban that. I mean, if a kid wants to wear, like when I was in 6th grade and I had like one of those Spuds McKenzie t-shirts, that was like a beer t-shirt. And then they're like, well, you can't wear that shirt. You got to turn it inside out. It's like, actually, I don't think you can do that. I don't think schools can do that.
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure public schools have had like uniform policies. Certainly, dress codes are still a thing. Schools have rules. They have posted hours. You can't just walk into a school and do whatever you want, say whatever you want. Like this is an argument that, and it's perfect for this podcast and for our audience because we actually appreciate these nerdy, wonky nuances. But this reminds me of the argument that I used to get in with folks back during the height of the BLM thing, and when we were blocking freeways and whatnot, where they'd be like, "Oh, it's a public road. People have a right to be there." It's like, what are you talking about? Like, yes, it's a public road. That doesn't mean that you, as a member of the public, just get to do whatever you want with it. Like, that's not the implication of that term. We have public libraries. You can't just walk in there and start setting stuff on fire because oh, it's public, right? Um, Military installations are public installations, government funded. Lots of rules involved in how you can access them and on what terms, right? So a piece of property, and this is the danger, and you point out private schools, this is the danger of taking something that properly ought to be private and making it public. Property is property regardless of ownership. Just because the property is public property does not mean you can do anything you want with it. It means that the terms upon which you can interact with that property are dictated by public policy. And that public policy theoretically can be whatever the hell the legislature wants. So if we decide that people can't use a public road to have protests and to stand around and block traffic, and that indeed is the law, like we have laws against jaywalking and obstructing traffic and what have you, then that's the law. And you don't get to say that because it's a public road, I could just violate the public purpose for which that road exists.
Okay. I disagree that, I mean, I think if a school is public property, that that they can't ban free expression on that property. Just like if under a Democrat trifecta, the Democrats decided they were going to ban the American flag from being displayed in classrooms. I don't think they can do that. I don't think that a teacher who has a Gadsden flag flying in the classroom could be forced to take it down either. Now, you could have the school board fire that teacher, perhaps for if the teacher is teaching something about that flag that shouldn't be taught. But I think that it's sketchy ground. It's like, when I was in the legislature, I was a big fan of free speech on college campuses, because when I was in the legislature, they were banning conservative speakers from coming to campus. And they were trying to designate these small little areas in the malls to be free speech zones and banning free speech everywhere else on campus. You can't do that. It's against the Constitution. It's against the First Amendment. And so I also think that banning or preventing schools from banning a certain flag is dumb. They should be banning, they should just clarify that you can't ban any flag from being displayed in the schools.
Yeah, well, and that's just it, is that under this bill that we're talking about, and I believe it's another Finke bill, because of course, all the most interesting bills are Finke bills.
Yeah.
The representative has that going for them. Under this bill, you would have a scenario where indeed a school district, an administrator in Minneapolis could ban the Gadsden flag because it's harmful and hurtful.
Yeah.
But a school out in Wright County, where I live, wouldn't be able to ban the rainbow flag. And so it's one of the important concepts in First Amendment constitutional law is this idea of content neutrality, that you can prohibit expressions as long as the prohibition is content neutral. You can't say, for instance, that it's okay to block 35W when it's a Back the Blue rally, but it's not okay to block it when it's a Black Lives Matter rally, right? Like you can't pick and choose which speech you're going to highlight and support and emphasize and lift up while suppressing alternative speech and different opinions. And that is quite literally what this bill does. It is unconstitutional on its face It's utterly ridiculous. I'm calling it the in-your-face bill because that's kind of what it's meant to do. It's meant to create a situation where the LGBT community can go around and put it in your face without any sort of rebuff. And meanwhile, they're literally making it illegal for you to express any sort of countervailing point of view under these changes to the Human Rights Act. It is explicitly the establishment of a religion.
Well, I'll be interested to see where it goes and where the arguments come on the floor. But I think that before we propose banning certain things, we need to also remember what the First Amendment's about. Walter, I gotta jump to some meetings.
Sure.
I'll have to cut the podcast a little short, but I really appreciate the conversation, and I hope we'll have to get into some more conversation next week about things that are moving through the Capitol. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for tuning in for another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane. 1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it.